Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special webinar. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. So Keir Starmer went to Hull to wreck it. Let's hope we don't have to read too much into the choice of company name there to launch his big plans for government reform. We heard about wider use of AI, an attack on the Watchdog state, a promise to reduce administrative burdens. We have in the background plans for civil service reform. And then we had his big reveal about the abolition of NHS England. So we're going to spend the next hour diving into what these plans look like, what they add up to, whether they're going to help or hinder mission-driven government. And to do that, I'm joined by three top IFG colleagues in a last-minute substitution because we weren't expecting that NHS announcement either. I'm joined by Nick Davis, Programmes Director of our Public Services team and an expert on all things NHS and other public services too. Then Dr. Matthew Gill. Matthew leads our work on arm's length bodies, regulation, and dabbles a bit in AI as well. And last but by no means least, delighted to be joined by a relatively new recruit to the IFG top team, Hannah Keenan. Hannah is Associate Director in our Civil Service team and possibly a bit frustrated by the lack of detail on civil service reform that we heard from the Prime Minister. Remember, this is an opportunity for you to post all your questions, post them on Slido. Civil servants watching, if you've got questions, you can always not give us your name, though obviously we like to know who is bombarding us with questions. And please remember, if there's a sort of reasonable question about the area you're interested in, please upvote that rather than post your own question, because that way we can make sure that we ask the questions you're all most interested in. So let's kick off. Nick, the big reveal, the abolition of NHS England. Can you just tell us, in a bit of new reader start here, what exactly is NHS England and why did the Prime Minister tell us he wanted to get rid of it?
So NHS England is an arm's length body that was established in as part of the 2012 Health and Social Care Act. It is, in theory, supposed to be responsible for the operational management of the NHS, while the Department of Health and Social Care is supposed to take a wider and more strategic review of health and social care spending and policy. But in reality, the lines of between the two organisations have been a bit blurred, and it was this kind of duplication that was Keir Starmer gave as his main reason for removing NHS England, that we have two different teams and two different organisations both doing the same work. And Wes Streeting, in a statement that he's just made to the House of Commons, said that a leaner combined DHSC and NHS England will save hundreds of millions, and then also reduce the admin for doctors. And honestly, those are pretty good reasons. There is duplication. Those teams haven't always worked well together, and frontline staff do feel overmanaged by the centre. I think probably the big unspoken reason for it is political accountability. Landley's big dream with Andrew Landley, the then Health Secretary, his big dream with the Health and Social Care Act was to take the politics out of the NHS. But in reality, the Secretary of State is always the one who's held to account. And I think Wes Streeting probably felt that if he was going to be held to account for it anyway, he might as well have all the levers at his disposal.
So is this going to make the sort of reforms, the big, promises we've seen in the plan for change, the milestones, is it going to make them easier to deliver, or is this upheaval? I'm slightly tempted to be sort of Dr. Brenda from Bristol saying, oh no, not another one, because it's sort of Secretary of State always, when they can't do anything else, attempted to reorganise the NHS, and maybe this is another one. Is this going to promote reform? Is it going to make it easier for the government to achieve its objectives by the end of the Parliament, or is it going to be quite a long-term distraction?
So look, ultimately, it could make it easier. But in the short term, this is a reform in its own right. Never mind the actual kind of performance reforms that Wes Streeting wants to make. As you say, I think it will be hugely disruptive. So Streeting, again, has just said in the Commons right now that much of this can be done without legislation, but that they are going to need to have a bill. And the kind of the whole process of bringing NHS England's functions into the department is likely to take 2 years. And that's a lot of ministerial and official time and energy that's going to be focused on that, rather than the huge performance issues across the NHS. Wes Streeting, his headline target is he wants to reduce 18-week waits for elective care, but he also wants to make these three big shifts. He wants to shift care out of hospitals into the community. He wants to make care more preventative, and he wants to make it more tech enabled. But how he's able to do that whilst also meeting the existing headline hospital targets on electives on A&E, it's not really clear. And I think ultimately making successful reforms means having a really clear vision, but I don't think Streeting has yet articulated one. And perhaps that's going to come with the 10-year plan that's expected in the summer. But ultimately, this is all on Streeting now. He's taken all the responsibility and it's on him to deliver.
Nick, I just want to put to you a couple of comments that have come in on Slido, and thanks people for being so quickly off the mark. The most upvoted comment, I think it's more of a comment, but that's come in, is from Anonymous. Anonymous says, regardless of the need for change, can the panel comment on the way in which the staff affected by this are being treated? NHS England staff found out about its abolition 2 minutes after Starmer's announcement, and John Hannon has commented that he sympathises with the desire, the motivations for this change, but it feels like a chaotic process. Does that tell us anything about the government's capacity to drive change? Any comments about the way this has been handled? We've seen some very high-level departures from NHS England in the past week, haven't we?
Yeah, so look, I do think it has been chaotic, and I think it's probably been triggered by Amanda Pritchard, the chief executive of NHS England, announcing a few weeks ago, a bit surprisingly, that she was resigning. Now, I think that was seen as her jumping before she was pushed, but it does seem to have led to much kind of quicker action than was possibly anticipated. And just this week, as you said, so on Monday, we had kind of separate reporting that the NHS England's chief financial officer, chief operations officer, and chief delivery officer were all standing down in the coming weeks, and that NHS England was going to be expected to make 50% cuts to its workforce. And so it's unclear to what extent the announcement of that news has then led to this, or this was always the plan. But if this was always the plan, this probably isn't the way you would have gone about it. And as those who've kind of left comments said, this is going to be a bit of an emotional whirlwind for those who are working not just in NHS England, but across the whole NHS. There are people with really important jobs who need to keep on doing them, and it's hard to say what kind of impact this process is going to have on that.
And Nick, just one thing that you might have caught up with from Wes Streeting's statement, which I have to say I didn't watch, just a question about what about some of the other health quangos, things like the Care Quality Commission? Are they still hanging around intact, or do we have a wider health rationalisation programme here?
So again, it's a little bit unclear, and there were also a number of other bodies that had previously been rolled into NHS England that are now effectively also going to be rolled into the department. It's unclear whether those will become independent again. And separately, there was reporting yesterday that integrated care boards, which are the organisations that are responsible for kind of deciding priorities in local areas, that they were being asked to make 50% cuts to their operating budgets. So that might just be a kind of cost-saving measure, or that might be an indication that the government is planning a kind of a wider reform of the whole architecture of the NHS, both nationally and more locally.
Okay, Nick, I'm going to let you take a bit of a time off briefly, but Matthew, you've written more generally about how to go about abolishing public bodies. NHS England is the sort of mother of all quangos. Is the government going about abolishing this in the right way? What does Wes Streeting need to watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, what Nick said is obviously really interesting here, that it's not clear whether announcing it today was the plan or not. And I think we'll find that out over the next few days in terms of how coordinated and prepared some of the communication from NHS England is in terms of precisely those questions about how it relates to other bodies, how functions are going to be moved, what people's future roles are. It's to some extent inevitable with a change of this sort that a small number of people will know about it in advance and then there'll be an announcement. But handling the process well from here is really, really important. They need to set out internally and externally what the goals of this change are, what is actually intended to change on the ground, how it will affect people's jobs, the way they're doing their work, and the interactions with the wider ecosystem around NHS England. They also need to set realistic timetables for this. Change like this will take years to go from where they are now to where they want to be, unless it is just a rebadging of operations, and one assumes it's much more than that. So these things can take time and should be managed realistically, and they should also be thinking about who's accountable for what in the transition process. So set out what your end state is, but also think how are you getting there, and what are the interim steps, and where are the different parts of the body going to be reporting to in that time. I'd also say finally that managing a transition like this is a skill set in itself. So they should definitely be bringing in people, if they aren't in there already, who've done this sort of thing before to advise on how to make it work well.
I mean, the government does set up public bodies and abolish them quite frequently. So you would hope that there is a developed skill set around that.
There is, but the knowledge transfer is sometimes not as good as it could be. So making sure those connections are made is really important.
Indeed. So while NHS England was on the chopping block today, the Prime Minister did use his speech to make a more general sort of attack, sideswipe, not quite sure what you might describe it, on what he termed the watchdog state, and took his predecessors, and perhaps himself as well, to task for their knee-jerk reaction to problems of, oh my God, I'd better just create another arm's length body. Are we about to see another bonfire of the quangos? Is this leading to a real reform? Do you think the Prime Minister's got a sort of clear agenda here? And is he forgetting why we sometimes do create arm's length bodies? Matthew?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I would say, first of all, that the number of quangos over time has been falling. So there were, in the low thousands in the 1970s, and we're now down to 300. So I think the headline announcements being the a merger of the payment systems regulator and the financial ombudsman service into the FCA, which they already work very closely together with, being the sort of headline abolitions that they come up with, might suggest that we are, if not at the end of the road of that process, near the end of the road of it. However, it's definitely important to guard against a political instinct to say, I need to be seen to be doing something about something. Let's set up a new body. One should always be looking at, can an existing body, or indeed central government, or indeed the private sector, do the thing that we want done without setting up a new organization? And so there are checks in place to prevent that. Government is always, in theory, looking at public bodies as a last resort. So I think what we should be doing is expecting the government to look case by case at where the functions bodies perform are not needed, or where they can be performed elsewhere or merged together. But beyond that, I think we should be quite careful about a narrative that is in general critical of activities of government that are done at arm's length. They're often put at arm's length for a reason, because of technical expertise, the need to plan over a long time horizon, the need for independence from politicians. And we should be thinking analytically on a case-by-case basis, is that necessary? And if it is necessary, how can we set up the responsibilities and the reporting lines effectively to make that work well, rather than just saying it's a problem? Because ministers can't micromanage everything from the centre. So delegation will have to take place. I mean, even in the case of NHS England, there are going to be questions about which decisions are made by Wes Streeting and which decisions are made elsewhere in NHS England, and how those responsibilities are divided up. Those questions don't just go away because it ceased to be a quango.
Very interesting. We've got a couple of questions coming in here. One from anonymous, there's an awful lot of anonymous questions, can I just say? Thanks everybody watching. One just pointing out Grenfell, infected blood, post office, etc. Were these failures of the watchdog state, and will similar failures be avoided by greater political accountability, or will more be missed by fewer officials with bigger workloads? But I wanted to ask you this, Matthew. One of the other things that the Prime Minister promised was to cut red tape, or at least cut the administrative costs of regulation by 25%. Now, some of us are old enough to have been involved in previous administrative burdens exercise, and in a sort of separate briefing, number 10 were pointing out that actually we don't have a baseline from which we can measure the 25%. You know, how do you go about that? What do you think that might start to look like? What would a sensible programme of cutting administrative burdens look like that avoids just sort of running into some of those other problems of failure of regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the question of what is the baseline is obviously key to measuring whether you have reduced something by 25%. But setting that to one side, I suppose you can achieve a reduction in regulatory burden either by reducing the amount of regulation, which might mean leaving some areas that are currently regulated unregulated and defining low risk areas where people can make their own decisions, or moving from a rules-based to a more principles-based approach to regulation. So rather than setting out a lot of detailed rules about how something should be done, you set out some outcomes that you think people should achieve and hold them to account for that, which can be administratively simpler sometimes while achieving the same objective. The other way of achieving a reduction in burden would be to make the same rules easier to comply with. And I think where this question relates to the theme that also came up in the speech around artificial intelligence is that you can imagine that if forms become easier to fill in, government websites become easier to navigate, some of these processes being automated, it may mean that it's possible to reduce the regulatory burden without actually reducing the amount of regulation that is out there. And that may be what the government's hoping to do.
That's really interesting to see what the scope is for AI there. Hannah, you've been very quiet, but can I just tell you that about 98% of the questions are all going to come your way, perhaps reflecting our audience today. So you will get your chance. So I think we expected a bit more about civil service reform, didn't we, in this? Because the pitch was being rolled quite extensively by Pat McFadden, but then the Prime Minister ducked away. He seems to have a bit of a new line as well on the civil service since his outing around the plan for change back at the end of last year. So what do we now know about the government's plans for civil service reform?
Well, Jill, I think you are probably right. And the short answer is not very much more than we knew at the weekend, unfortunately. I think we should welcome the fact that the language has changed a lot. So we've moved on. You mentioned Starmer's speech in December around the plan for change. We talked about the tepid bath of decline. I think we can all say that we're quite glad not to see that type of language, and certainly not the type of language we've seen in the States or anything around Operation Chainsaw in the speech today. System-wide, you're seeing that Starmer's using language that is sort of on the side of civil servants. It's talking about a fantastic civil service and saying that they are stuck in a system. They want to do the right thing, but they're not able to do it. I think fundamentally, though, we didn't learn a huge amount more about how Starmer plans to break civil servants out of that system that they feel stuck in. We had a little bit on 2,000 tech jack apprentices and a sense that Starmer was going to use AI and tech innovation to make the state more efficient and more innovative, but certainly not any of the detail that I think we would have wanted to see underneath that.
So we had this line brief that 1 in 10 civil servants are going to be working on data or tech. How big a change would that be? And do you think that's sort of feasible in the way in which we recruit, retain, pay civil servants at the moment?
So I think it would be a big change. I think the latest target was 1 in 20. And so it's a big ambition. It absolutely requires some slightly more, and I hesitate to say the word boring, but I think this is right, boring and sustained changes to the way that the civil service operates. So I think what we had hoped to see from Pat McFadden's pitch rolling, as you mentioned over the weekend, was a little bit more on how you manage poor performance in the civil service. And this does relate, so that what we've been calling for is to make it easier for managers who are spotting poor performance in their team to either address it or ultimately, if needed, to dismiss poor performers. Now, Pat McFadden spoke a bit about this at the weekend and said, we'll make it easier to incentivise poor performers to leave. But the reason that this matters, and the reason that it matters that this wasn't addressed in the speech, is if you are a bit worried about civil service numbers, which I think this government is in some ways, you cannot look to bring lots and lots more tech people into government unless you are also finding a way to remove the people who are not performing in government. So it has to go hand in hand. You need to find a way to reward your high performers, to bring in people who are experts in tech, as well as retraining people in tech and data. But you also need to find a way to not have poor performers cycling around the civil service and instead have them leave.
I mean, there's a question here this is the most upvoted question by really quite a long way, from Anonymous. The headlines have been that ministers are unsatisfied with the performance of the civil service, though, as you say, the Prime Minister's slightly more now blaming the system rather than, we had some words about fantastic civil servants frustrated by the system. Just asking, Hannah, you might pick this one up first, Nick and Matthew, pile in if you want. Does the panel have any insight into what their specific concerns are about civil service performance? What's the source of that frustration? Hannah, do you want to have a go at that?
I think it's very hard to talk for ministers and politicians as a whole. I think what we've heard from Starmer a few times, and certainly in today's speech, is something about the innovative nature or the lack of innovation in the system. And I think that's probably where some of the frustration is starting to come from, without speaking on behalf of ministers who aren't saying it themselves. But I think this comes back to, are we enabling ministers and the civil servants who are often in discussions with them to have an open conversation about what those expectations are? So again, today we saw lots of talk about needing to change the system, needing to tear open Whitehall, needing to have mission-led government. What I don't think we've yet seen, either from civil servants or from ministers, is a clear enough articulation of what that actually means in practice.
Okay, well, that comes on. I'm going to hold Nick and Matthew, clearly absolutely gagging to get in, but I'm going to hold them back for a second. We've got quite a lot of comments about, actually it's easy to paraphrase. It's easy to talk about reform. It's harder to do. Anonymous, having been through similar changes in the past, generally what happens is realization not enough people do the work. Lots of taxpayer money is then used for private sector consultants. We know that Rachel Reeves wants a blitz on consultants, suggests that actually some of this criticism may demoralize civil service. Lots of people worried about actually, has the government got the right narrative about civil service reform? Maybe that links into that morale point. And a final question, which is appearing on the same page here, about we've got civil service reform and local government devolution reform running along separate tracks. Now, we haven't got anyone from our excellent devolution team here, but is there any sense that those join up? Because although the Prime Minister's been focusing on the sort of central civil service, maybe the wider public services emphasis on frontline delivery, there are lots and lots of people delivering services, working on government who actually aren't in what we call the sort of civil service, that 500,000 number. So thoughts about, I am going to bring you other two in because you'll have views on this. Actually, how do you develop a coherent plan and narrative about reform that doesn't demotivate people and which can be delivered without engaging every consultant around the country and actually doing lots of PowerPoint packs?
So I think, sorry, I'll jump in if that's all right.
Yes.
I think there are three things from my perspective. One is language about bringing civil servants on side. And I think actually we've seen some really, really good and helpful language from both McFadden and from Starmer today in terms of actually saying we are on the side of civil servants and we do want to do this with you. So I think that is the first thing to start with. And I think that does feel like a change in tone and that is good. The second bit about how do you set up a proper plan for reform? We have quite a few papers on this, very happy to send them out. It's about consistency. and it's about getting into the detail of it and some of the nitty-gritty changes that you need to make to the civil service, about making it easier to get rid of poor performers, about rewarding proper high performance, about addressing some of the things like churn. And I will say addressing some of the pay issues will be part of that. It takes sustained and slightly boring leadership to keep going through that. And I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity that Keir Starmer, as the Prime Minister, as the Minister for the Civil Service, didn't take this opportunity to say, I care about reform and I understand what it actually takes to do it, and to send that signal to civil servants. And then I will pass over to the others as well to talk a bit about, you asked about local government reform and civil service reform happening on these twin tracks. I think I'd like to refer back to some of what we mean by mission-led government. In theory, is about opening up the state and bringing in local government, bringing in people, as Starmer spoke about today. That takes a slightly more or less risk-averse civil service. And again, you need ministers to set that tone, you need civil servants to set that tone, and you need to find a way to have a really open, honest, frank conversation between civil servants and ministers about what level of risk-taking this government wants to see from its civil service.
I mean, Nick, can I just build on, Hannah mentioned the great words mission-led government. It's quite impressive to get to an IFG event about the government 25 minutes in and not use the words mission-led government. Obviously, health is one of the government's top missions. And if I was sitting in number 10, I'd be worried that that's probably the one, after maybe cost of living, that's really going to have to deliver. Do we now think the government does have a sort of coherent view of how this mission approach fits in? And this big NHS reform wasn't part of the sort of mission that they promised, this big structural reforms. Indeed, I think West Streeting ruled it out for quite some time and said he wasn't going to do that. So do we think that there is clarity now emerging of, you know, what the government wants to say about the NHS and how it's going to be changing over the rest of their time until the next election in 2028, 2029?
So I think it's pretty clear that the now government did not do as much thinking about what a mission-led approach would mean in practice in opposition as it could have done. And it's therefore been largely working that out whilst in power in terms of how the individual mission boards work, how frequently they meet, the role of the Prime Minister in those, how that's going to feed in to the spending review. They're getting there, but I do think that has implications for how mission-led the spending review is actually going to be. Likewise, I don't think that Keir Starmer has today had a kind of clear public service reform vision. There are clearly some areas of public service, like criminal justice and prisons in particular, that he has views on, but he hasn't, for example, provided a clear steer on the extent to which his government is going to rely on some of the kind of tools used by Labour, what's called like new public management, you know, competition, service user choice, targets, etc., or whether his vision is for kind of greater collaboration and coordination between local services, giving staff greater autonomy, etc. And as a result of that, you've had individual secretaries of state going about things in their own different ways. And therefore, you've got, you know, quite an advanced reform agenda under Angela Rayner in local government, with kind of big plans on English devolution. You've got Bridget Phillipson in education, who's also been making quite a lot of moves in terms of changing how inspection works, etc., in terms of the freedoms that academies have. And then you've got the NHS, which I think under Streeting has probably got the least clarity about what its approach to public service reform is. And so this is clearly what we've heard today as part of that. And I think at the centre of government in the Cabinet Office, they are also now trying to kind of weave together a cross-cutting and coherent vision for public service reform that can sit on top of the more siloed work that's happening in individual departments. But I think it's fair to say today that there hasn't been a clear vision, and therefore there's been kind of much more progress in some areas than there has been in others, and it hasn't always been coordinated.
Can I just ask you a question? This is Michael Pickin from Glasgow has asked a bit about what the implications are for devolved areas and devolved elections. I think I might say, Michael, we probably need a different catalyst on this with our Devo team in here. But there is a part of his question that is very relevant. Are there likely impacts on NHS Scotland, NHS Cymru, or NHS Northern Ireland, which of course separately managed? And I'm just quite interested. The NHS England model wasn't, I think, replicated in those jurisdictions. There was what we're treating as recreating more political control, but I don't think they've necessarily performed loads better than NHS England over the last decade and a half. So does that suggest that political accountability isn't a sort of magic bullet to better performance?
Yeah, it's definitely not a magic bullet, and you're absolutely right that those have been devolved competencies for some time. So this will only affect NHS England, and I suppose the only way that it will have an impact on the NHS in other parts of the country is if it has spending implications that then are kind of passed through and passed down. You're right. I mean, certainly there's pretty good evidence that under the last Labour government, their approach to NHS reform led to improvements much more quickly. And, the NHS in Wales has for quite a long time been the kind of go-to retort for Conservative ministers and now shadow ministers saying, well, hang on, you've been in charge of the NHS in part of the country for a long time and it's performing really poorly there. So what the changes made today won't necessarily have an impact on performance. As I said before, it is really now down to Wes Streeting to do something.
Right. Okay, Matthew, do you think the government's got a coherent narrative about the wider sort of public sector landscape, including all those arm's length bodies that you look at?
I'm not sure they have, Jill, at the moment. I think we're hearing certainly in the sort of rhetoric, the kind of frustration with delivery and wanting to get things done, and sort of casting out and criticizing areas of the civil service or public bodies that may be getting in the way of that. I think but I think what we haven't certainly seen today, which I think ahead of it you might have thought would be, as I think you mentioned at the start, another bonfire of the Quangos. There hasn't been a kind of a long list of bodies to be kind of abolished or got rid of. But I think what the position they're in is they are able to think for at least the medium term, if not the long term at this stage in the political cycle. They're able to plan ahead, and so you've just got to hope that the reforms that they choose to do are thought through and are going to lead to a return that justifies, as the other commenter suggested, the cost that making these reforms does imply. So the best thing they can do is look at the specifics of each case and plan what they're trying to achieve.
The Prime Minister took a bit of a knock at, I think, Sport England or someone for blocking a development in Bingley because cricket balls might land in gardens. I don't particularly want cricket balls landing on my head when I'm sunbathing, but anyway. And indeed, famous jumping spiders, which are the new newts or bats, depending on that. And clearly sees at least some quangos as being on the side of the blockers versus the unleashers of growth. Do you think that's fair that these bodies are actually all getting in the way of, the government's political mission to build 1.5 million housing, roll out energy infrastructure and stuff like that?
It's sometimes fair and sometimes not. It's probably the only answer I could give to that. But let's take the example of the spiders and their housing development. So what will have happened there is that you've got a body that is responsible for advising on the wildlife impact of developments, which knows a lot about spiders. By the nature of that, recruits people into it who know and care a lot about spiders, and therefore is aware of that problem and articulates it. Now, the way Keir Starmer has articulated the problem, there is a veto there that perspective can exert on development against housing. It seems to me that the problem in that situation, if it is politically agreed that it is a problem, is that is a veto. If instead that was a factor to be considered, something to be taken into account, something to have regard to, there was a particular a mechanism by which the different issues can be weighed against each other, you wouldn't get into that standoff position. Now, the question then is the fact that that's a veto a necessary artifact of the fact that it's a separate arm's length body that might be making the decision about spiders to what's trying to achieve house building? Well, not necessarily. It's possible to create a body that has a series of objectives, but then has to feed those into a consultation or negotiation process with other decision makers. And even if a separate body wasn't doing all of the work to look at spiders, you would still have to have a hierarchy of concerns that would have to be worked out and a decision be made. So it seems to me that he's pointing to that hierarchy of priority being too fixed or not in line with the political consensus. And that can sometimes be associated with particular bodies and get stuck in the development of particular bodies, but it's not necessarily an artifact of that.
Okay. Might just be the regulations the body thinks it's having to follow.
Exactly, and probably is legally obliged to follow. So in a lot of those situations, the regulator making the pronouncement will say, well, we've got our statutory duties, we've got our powers, and as a direct result of this, we have to say X. And so that is a problem of regulation. It's a problem faced by a lot of public bodies, that actually the legislation that they are implementing, once they are set up, is then not kept up to date. So very often they'll be working with legislation that can be decades old, and everybody knows that this is problematic, but they aren't empowered to do anything about it.
And Matthew, just the last question to you, and then Hannah and I have so many questions for you about what poor performance is and where the government's really taking aim, things like that. But got a couple of questions. One, pointing out that the government's about to create lots of new watchdogs in transport on railways, think of part of Great British Rail and things like that. And others noting the sort of lots of quangos being set up, NESO, regional NESO, National Wealth Fund, GB Energy, in the energy space. I think, do they actually say energy space? They do, energy policy space. So do you think all Keir Starmer's ministers have got the message about this, or is this sort of sensible? Will Keir Starmer need to rewire his ministers to his new agenda, being concerned about creating watchdogs?
Oh, I think he's been pretty clear. So I'm sure they've got the message. I think where you might look where the message may not be as clear is sort of, for instance, ombuds or commissioners that aren't classified as public bodies and therefore don't come under the lens of this debate, and where the checks on establishing those are maybe less robust or less visible. But certainly in the world of public bodies, I think this question of trying to minimize their number has a high profile. And as I say, historically, we're at a historic low in terms of numbers. I would also say that list of bodies that's being set up by the government is not out of proportion to the number of bodies that were set up by the previous government and other governments. It would amount, spread over the parliament, to setting up 3 to 5 bodies a year maybe, and no government has done less than that.
Okay, Hannah, it's your moment in the sun. Anne is asking, do you think the poor performance comments are targeted at senior civil servants to see changes in leadership and culture, freeing other grades to be innovative and get on with their work without restraints of the old guard's ways of working? Or anonymous, taking a different view, is do you think the focus on performance of the SCS goes far enough, given that actually delivery responsibility often goes further down the chain? And then some other things about the extent to which there's really a plan for retraining some of these civil servants, that big expansion we've seen since the referendum that Keir Starmer mentioned. Is there a plan for offering new digital AI skills in the brave new world so that we can redeploy people rather than just get rid of them? So what does a top to bottom better performance regime really look like? Do we have a view?
Certainly have a view on some parts of it. This needs to be about performance at every level. this can't just look at the senior civil service. This can't just look at operational delivery roles or the policy profession. It has to cut across absolutely everything. So I think it's probably a bit of a false dichotomy to say, do we need to focus this on SCS? Do we need to focus this on junior civil servants, on frontline roles? It's got to be right across the board. I think looking at poor performance, for me, that has to be senior civil servants and junior civil servants alike. And you have to be empowering managers who are the only ones who can actually determine what performance is like in the civil service to then manage that poor performance. And there's absolutely checks and balances that you have to put on that. We definitely have to be protecting people, but we also need to be really clear about where performance isn't up to scratch and to give managers the tools that they need to be able to manage and ultimately, if necessary, dismiss people. I think, again, it would have been lovely to have today a bit more detail from what McFadden put out over the weekend. So we heard a bit from him over the weekend on having more performance-related pay for the senior civil service, which I think already exists to some extent, but are there plans for more of this? Was this an announcement of something that already happens? And there were, again, a trail for a mutually agreed exits process to incentivise poor performers to leave. I have quoted that because we don't have the detail on what that means, but it would have been nice to see some more of that. On your retraining question, if there is a plan, I haven't seen one. And again, it's something that we need. We are talking quite a lot in the civil service about how do you professionalise? So it's a question that's really live in the policy profession at the moment. We've seen a big growth in the policy profession numbers in the civil service, in particular in the last few years, and in particular at sort of grade 7, grade 6, what you might call sort of middle management, just below the senior civil service. Big growth in policy profession there. And the policy profession is aiming to set standards to really kind of bring up the quality of the policy profession. It would be interesting to see if they're planning to do something similar on the AI and tech side.
Actually, Hannah, that's very interesting. Another question from another anonymous. Got the shyest ever audience today. Asking about the growth in the size of the civil service. I think Keir Starmer quoted around 100,000 or so more, I think, since the referendum. What's driven that growth? And I think an allied question is, how low could it feasibly go? I mean, if David Cameron and George Osborne had had their way and there hadn't been a referendum, I think we were going to see the civil service by 2020 down to 300,000 or something. Instead of today, it's about 515,000, I think. It's our latest figures. So what's a big driver of growth? Is it just Brexit? Is it sort of COVID? Is there more flab? Is it everybody trying to deal with the asylum backlog? What exactly is it? And could you drive those numbers down, and maybe, with or without tech?
So you hit on the two massive drivers of civil service growth, which are Brexit and COVID, where we saw sort of big increases. But since 2016, the civil service has grown every year. Jill, you're spot on. We're at just over 515,000 now. We were at 384,000 pre-referendum. So you can see kind of the quite large growth that you have there. I think Starmer was spot on to say, this isn't an ideological argument about how big the state will be. It's about getting it to work better. And again, for a long time, the IFG has said we shouldn't have headcount targets. And indeed praised Pat McFadden over the weekend for not going on and saying this is what the headcount target should be. They can be quite distortive in terms of the incentives that they set. So I think really it's much more about saying, how do you do proper strategic workforce planning? What are the objectives of the state? What people do you need to then deliver that? And then giving tools to people to either train them or reward them or incentivize them fundamentally to be able to deliver those objectives. On your AI question, Prime Minister in the speech today talked about sending small AI teams into each department to make the state more innovative and efficient. Will be really interesting to see what that again, what that looks like in practice and whether that has any impact on how efficient the state is, or certainly on civil service numbers. But I think the question has to be about how do you get people to do their jobs more effectively and spend more time using their human judgment, and less about how many people can you cut because you've replaced them with AI.
I mean, it's quite interesting because actually one of the top ranked questions here is about tech apprentices that we're promised, but you need to have some capability already in order to train lots and lots of tech apprentices. Do you think that's a sort of feasible thing, this number of 2,000 tech apprentices, one of the sort of hard numbers we got today?
I mean, 2,000 isn't a huge proportion of a civil service of 515,000 people, so it doesn't seem unfeasible. I suppose part of my question on the apprentices is then, what is that long-term career path, and how are we bringing those skills into the civil service? How are we making sure that those people are being used, that they are being upskilled, but then that is growth in knowledge throughout the whole civil service, and it's changing the way that people approach their jobs. So I think the announcement seems, eminently sensible. Bring in more tech expertise, great, but this is quite a small drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the change that's needed.
Matthew, question here, again from Anonymous. Quite often people in ALBs are paid more than people in core departments, but if we merge functions back into a core department, is that likely to is that going to cause problems around pay? Have we seen that in the past? And, have you got any advice on how to handle that pay differential?
I mean, I think that's certainly true. Usually that is because the public body will have exemptions from pay constraints because it's trying to recruit skills that are in shortage in the market and for which they have to pay a premium. Now, you would think that if they've had to pay a premium to get skills that are in NHS England, they're going to recognise that that's still the case when it moves into government, and those pay restraints will move across. Certainly people on existing terms and conditions would expect to have those terms and conditions moved over into the new employer rather than to just move into different terms and conditions, unless there's an extensive sort of consultation and change process associated with it. But I think it's certainly the narrative that's come from government. If you look at AI, for instance, explicitly talking about working outside of civil service pay constraints in order to recruit the kind of technical expertise needed to drive that area forward. So I think the government is mindful of the fact that if it wants specialist workforces, it does have to pay for them.
Okay, and Nick, we've got a question here about somebody's saying about the approach to public sector reform, dismemberment of NHS England already been signalled, compliance cost target. Did some of these numbers just seem plucked out of the air? A question specifically for you: how will the merger and eventual abolition of NHS England affect oversight and accountability, especially in relation to the renewed focus of integrated care boards? I think that's what ICBs stand for, on strategic commissioning. Do we know actually how the new system will work? And because Wes Streeting can't do everything from his office, however much he wants to be in control and personally accountable, can he? So do we have a clue about how this new thing will work?
Yeah, so look, ultimately, ICB accountability is now going to flow to the department and to ministers rather than via NHS England. Exactly what those mechanisms look like is TBC, and I think that is something that I would certainly expect the 10-year NHS plan that's currently in development to focus on, because for example, there are working groups looking at the kind of the vision of what the system looks like, but also the enablers that's looking, for example, about the use of targets, wider accountability, how kind of financial flows are going to work in the system. So I don't think we have any firm answers on that at the moment, and I don't think there's a single right answer. But I think what's important is that all of the incentives are aligned, which they are not at the moment and have not been for some time. And the only way you have alignment is if there's clarity about system purpose and priorities. And again, that's ultimately a responsibility for Wes Streeting.
And do we expect to see that in the 10-year plan that has been much talked about? And do we have a timetable for that?
Yeah, so we expect that in the 10-year plan. And I think, well, the intention initially was that it would come out at the same time as the spending review. The spending review is now scheduled for June. I would expect the 10-year plan at a similar time, but I think it's clear that not all is well within NHS and DHSC land, and it wouldn't surprise me if the need to suddenly think about how you're going to merge those two organizations has some impact on the timeline, or if they stick to the existing timeline on the level of detail that is included within those plans.
And we also have a bit of a, I mean, it'd be unfair to call it a leadership vacuum, but a couple of sort of temporary, we don't have a permanent secretary of DHSC.
No.
We have a sort of interim, I think, chief executive of NHS England. I mean, is that a problem as well, or?
Yeah, so Jim Mackey was appointed as interim, and I think it was clear that when it was announced all of 3 weeks ago, it seems like a different world now, that he would only be there for around 2 years, and he has previously had national leadership roles, and I think it's fair to say that all the evidence suggests that he doesn't have a great desire to continue in a national leadership role. So in many ways, that's quite helpful if you're abolishing a body that its chief executive doesn't have a great desire to stay on. I think the really interesting thing is the question of the extent to which this policy and wider health policy is now being driven from number 10. Obviously, the new cabinet secretary was previously the permanent secretary of DHSC. Keir Starmer's comms director was previously comms director of NHS England. To what extent has his thinking been guided by those people who've come into number 10 from the health world?
Very, very interesting. And we have in the past had the NHS chief executive and the Department of Health, Social Care, Department of Health permanent secretary be the same person. So yeah, that is a way of rationalising at least one post. But anyway.
And in some ways, it might be helpful, actually, that those positions are vacant at this moment, because there's clearly going to be a huge amount of change, and you want people in those leadership roles who are ready to embrace the change and drive it forward. So Wes Streeting will certainly not be able to avoid that accountability that he wants for both the direction of travel and the personnel in place delivering it.
And just to mention that leadership vacuum, obviously at the moment, the whole of government is going through a spending review process at the moment. This is like the big set piece that is going to decide how much money individual departments have for the rest of this parliament. Whatever you think about the value of changes, this feels like a somewhat suboptimal time to have a huge leadership vacuum in the NHS, and to have the chief financial officer of the NHS standing down midway through the spending review process. So I mean, who knows what kind of chaos that is causing for the submission process.
Yeah, and also at that time where you need to absolutely give certainty. So this question about pay and rations, people need to know.
I think vacuum is somewhat suboptimal. It might be the most IFG comment ever. But anyway, Hannah, quite a lot of questions coming in, which you might put under the general bracket of skepticism about civil service reform. Pay, the way in which we go about redundancies, ability to attract these skills that we want, current pay levels, why we're focusing on poor performers rather than getting in better performers. Do permanent secretaries actually have the skills it takes to do sort of transformation? Do you want to just sort of do a bit about, do we have what it takes? Another person about, Nick was mentioning the spending review, that fine to talk about some new skills, but L&D budgets are being squeezed. Does the civil service actually have the space, bandwidth, capability to reform itself as ministers seem to want it reformed?
It does, and it has to. And I think it has to come with proper ministerial support and direction. But picking up on a couple of things that you've mentioned in there, we absolutely do have to talk about pay, because it is also a huge driver of churn in the civil service. If you are in the civil service and you are promoted into a new role, you are at the bottom of that pay band, and there is no world in which you can progress through that pay band. And so your incentive really is to move to another job and to keep moving to other jobs where you can get promotions or to other departments where you might be paid more in order to find a way to increase your salary. That results in an unacceptably high level of churn, and it results in the loss of institutional memory in departments and in roles. And that is a huge issue for the civil service as an institution and for the whole system. So absolutely pay needs to be part of the discussion. And 100% we cannot focus only on removing poor performers. Totally agree with whoever's asked the question there or made the comment. This also has to be about how do you either improve performance levels or reward good performers. These two things definitely have to come hand in hand. On your question about kind of L&D and skills, do you think this ties into institutional memory and some of the work that I mentioned earlier that the policy profession is doing in their area and other professions are doing, in that you can, of course, have formal L&D offers, and there are existing good ones and plans to improve, but you also need to have focused department and role specific learning that happens. And where you have people churning and moving through the civil service, you lose the institutional memory that lets managers and teams really do proper L&D on the job.
Okay, I'm going to finish up with the last question. Quick answers from all of you. Keir Starmer said his mission was to rewire the state and promised in his speech today that this would be a state that worked better for citizens. Does this vision that he set out today promise some real, genuine improvements? Matthew?
I think it certainly strikes the tone was convincing to me in terms of being interested in how well the state worked and wanting to drive that. I think, as we've been saying in the course of the hour, we haven't seen enough detail yet to see exactly how that's going to be implemented and to assess whether it will work.
Okay, so thumbs up from Matthew, more detail needed. Nick?
I think I'm probably slightly less interested in the kind of the structures than I am in what they do with it. And certainly when it comes to the NHS, we still don't really know what that's going to look like.
Okay, so big question marks. Hannah, is this sort of a big stepping stone towards a better civil service that serves the public better?
I hope so. And I'm with Matthew. The tone is right for it, but it absolutely needs much more detail to follow.
And just in terms of what concrete difference I might notice as a citizen, since you've all answered those so quickly, Hannah, what might you think is the one thing I should be looking to see as being done differently by 2028 that Keir Starmer will be able to point to and say, that's because of my whole speech?
Civil servants who feel like the system is working for them. Possibly hard to see as a citizen, but that they feel that, they are incentivized to do the things that they want to do.
Motivated civil service. Nick?
I think it'll be the same stuff that it's always been. Can you get a GP appointment? Are you waiting 12 hours in A&E? And can you get your hip replaced in a reasonable amount of time? And ultimately, that's the kind of retail offer that they need to make.
And Matthew, final word.
The reduction in regulatory burdens is a really interesting aspiration. Will it be achieved through AI? Will it be achieved through changes in the styles of regulation that we engage in? I think that will be one to watch.
Okay, I'm going to call it to a close there. Thanks very much to Hannah, Nick, and Matthew Gill. And can I give you a heads up about something very exciting that is happening? So do tell all your friends about this webinar. That will be available for you to rewatch. But we've talked a lot about what Keir Starmer said, but you can actually hear Keir Starmer talking for himself on our Inside Briefing podcast, which will be available later today. And not only do we have Keir Starmer telling our director, Hannah White, what he's really trying to achieve, but we also have a discussion there between our deputy director, Emma Norris, former Cabinet Secretary Gus O'Donnell, and our Whitehall Watcher-in-Chief, Alex Thomas. So do tune in for that very special Inside Briefing available later today. But of course, rewatch this webinar as many times as possible and share with all your friends. So thank you very much. And thanks for all those millions of questions. Goodbye.